What if I told you that the worst period of your life wasn't a breakdown, it was a breakthrough? That moment when everything fell apart, when you couldn't recognize yourself in the mirror, when the pain was so deep you thought you'd never recover. Carl Jung discovered something extraordinary about this suffering. He called it the soul's most painful test, and here's the truth that will change everything you thought you knew about your pain. Only 10% of people who enter this darkness ever make it through to the other side. But if you're watching this, there's a strong chance you're one of the rare few who survived. You didn't just survive. You graduated from the most intense spiritual education a human being can receive. The question Jung asked that haunted him for decades was this: why does the soul need to be broken to be fixed? By the end of this video, you'll understand the 7 signs that prove you haven't lost your mind. You've found your soul. Jung called this experience the Nigredo, the blackening, the darkest stage of transformation, where the old self must die before the new self can be born. Society labels this depression, anxiety, a mental breakdown, something to be fixed as quickly as possible with medication and therapy. But Jung saw something different. He called it the approach to the unconscious, the moment when your soul drags you into the underworld to show you what you've been refusing to see your entire life. This isn't therapy speak or positive thinking. This is dangerous territory, the psychological equivalent of walking through fire, the place where your carefully constructed identity dissolves, where everything you believed about yourself and the world crumbles into dust. Most people never recover from this. They medicate it into submission. They numb it with work, or relationships, or substances. They run from it until the day they die, still carrying that unfinished transformation like a ghost. But you didn't run. You walked straight into the fire because something in you knew there was no other way through, and that willingness changes everything. The first sign you pass the test is the collapse of meaning. Everything that used to make you happy suddenly felt empty. The career you worked so hard to build felt meaningless overnight. The relationship that once excited you became hollow. Interactions that used to spark joy now felt like going through motions. The achievements that gave you pride turned into dust in your hands. Money, status, validation from others, all of it stopped working like a drug that no longer produces its high. Here's what Jung understood that most people miss. This wasn't depression destroying your ability to feel joy. This was your ego dying, a necessary death that feels like the end but is actually a beginning. Your false self, the identity you built to please your parents and survive in the world, was being dismantled piece by piece. The things that made that false self happy stopped working because that self was disappearing. You weren't losing your capacity for happiness. You were losing your capacity for fake happiness, for the shallow pleasures that kept you distracted from your soul's real hunger. The pain you felt during this collapse wasn't a malfunction of your brain chemistry. It was information, a message from the deepest part of yourself. Your soul was telling you that the life you were living wasn't yours, that you were following someone else's script. The desires you were chasing weren't your desires. They were implanted by advertising, by social conditioning, by childhood wounds. The goals you were pursuing weren't your goals. They belonged to your parents who lived their unlived lives through you, to your culture that measures worth in dollars and likes, to your wounded childhood self desperately seeking the approval that never came. And your soul, in its infinite wisdom, burned it all down, not to punish you, but to save you from a life of quiet desperation. Because you can't build an authentic life on a foundation of lies. The old structure had to collapse completely before something real could emerge from the ashes. The second sign is the mirror of isolation. You felt completely alone, even when surrounded by people who claimed to love you, even in rooms full of friends and family. Parties felt suffocating instead of fun, the noise and small talk pressing on you like physical weight. Small talk became unbearable. Those surface conversations about weather and work felt like speaking a language you no longer understood. You couldn't connect with anyone because you were no longer who you used to be, the person they knew and expected, but you didn't know who you were becoming, floating in the space between identities. Jung called this the hermit phase, the necessary withdrawal from the collective, to hear your own voice beneath the noise of everyone else's expectations. It's the loneliest stage of the journey because you're not just alone, you're alone with a self you don't yet know. Everyone around you seemed to be playing a game you could no longer participate in, operating by rules that suddenly seemed arbitrary and meaningless. They talked about things that felt utterly meaningless, status updates and gossip and complaints about problems that seemed trivial. They laughed at jokes that weren't funny, performed emotions they didn't feel, maintained conversations that went nowhere. They pursued goals that seemed hollow and empty, climbing ladders that led to nowhere worth going. And you felt like an alien who had landed on this planet, watching from the outside, unable to pretend anymore that any of this made sense. Here's what Jung discovered. This isolation wasn't loneliness in the traditional sense. It was spiritual labor, the hardest work a human being can do. You were doing the work of becoming yourself, of separating who you really are from who you were taught to be. And that work requires solitude, requires space away from the voices that have been telling you who to be since birth. Empaths aren't broken, they're alchemists in progress. The alchemist's path gives you drills, Jung-based boundaries, and 3 exclusive chapter videos to turn overwhelm into clarity. By Surreal Mind, 236-page downloadable ebook, in stock. Begin now at thesurrealmind.com. You had to be alone to separate your voice from the voices of everyone who ever told you who you should be. You had to withdraw from the noise to hear the whisper of your authentic self trying to emerge. The isolation felt like punishment, like evidence that something was wrong with you. But it was actually protection. Your soul was creating space for you to transform without the interference of people who needed you to stay the same. The hermit isn't running from the world. The hermit is preparing to return to the world as someone real. The third sign is the shadow ambush. You stopped being a good person and started being a whole person. All the anger you suppressed, the resentment you swallowed, the darkness you denied suddenly came flooding to the surface. You felt rage at people you loved. You noticed your capacity for cruelty, manipulation, selfishness. Everything you judged in others, you discovered in yourself. This terrified you because you built your identity on being kind, being helpful, being good. Jung knew this moment intimately. He called it shadow integration, the process of accepting that you contain every human quality, both light and dark. The good person persona isn't wholeness, it's denial. It's a mask that requires you to disown half of who you are, to project your darkness onto others, and maintain the illusion of purity. When your shadow ambushed you, you weren't becoming a bad person. You were becoming a real person. You were acknowledging that you have needs, boundaries, anger, and the right to say no. You were admitting that you're capable of the same darkness you see in others, and that admission is what makes you safe. Because people who deny their shadow act it out unconsciously. They hurt others while believing themselves to be innocent. But when you integrate your shadow consciously, you gain choice. You can feel anger without destroying. You can acknowledge selfishness without being consumed by it. You become dangerous in the best way. Dangerous to manipulation, to false harmony, to anyone who would exploit your goodness. This integration doesn't make you cruel. It makes you whole. It gives you access to your full power, including the power to protect yourself, to set boundaries, to say no when no is the right answer. The fourth sign is the loss of the persona. The mask you wore for society shattered, and you physically couldn't fake it anymore. You tried to go back to normal, to smile at the right times, to say the appropriate things, to perform the role everyone expected from you. but your body wouldn't cooperate. Your voice cracked when you tried to make small talk. Your hands shook when you tried to maintain composure. Your stomach churned when you tried to pretend everything was fine. The act that used to be effortless, that you could perform on autopilot without thinking, became impossible. Jung called the persona our social mask, the carefully crafted image we present to the world to gain acceptance and avoid rejection. It serves a function when you're young, helping you navigate social expectations, learn the rules, survive in environments where being yourself isn't safe. But at some point in the journey toward wholeness, the persona becomes a prison. You forget it's a mask. You start believing that the performance is who you really are, that the character you play in public is your true identity. When your persona shattered, it felt like humiliation. You couldn't maintain your composure at work, breaking down in meetings, or losing your cool in ways that embarrassed you. You broke down in front of people, crying or expressing emotions you were supposed to keep hidden. You said things you weren't supposed to say, truths that violated the unspoken rules of polite society. You felt exposed, vulnerable, like everyone could see through you to the mess underneath, the struggling human being beneath the polished surface. But here's the truth Jung discovered through his own breakdown and breakthrough. That shattering was liberation, even though it felt like destruction. The persona was exhausting you, consuming all your energy just to maintain an image that wasn't real, draining your life force to keep up appearances. When it broke, when you couldn't hold it together anymore, you felt weak. But actually, you were becoming strong in a completely different way. Strong enough to be authentic. Strong enough to disappoint people when their expectations don't serve your truth. Strong enough to let them see you as you actually are, rather than who they need you to be. The humiliation you felt was your ego's death rattle, the false self screaming as it dissolved. Your soul was celebrating. The fifth sign is radical disillusionment. You saw the lies everywhere. In your family, in your workplace, in your social circles, in the larger society. The unspoken agreements everyone was participating in suddenly became visible to you, and you couldn't unsee them no matter how hard you tried. Your family's toxic patterns they called love. Your workplace's dysfunction they called professionalism. Society's empty values they called success. The collective denial everyone agreed to maintain suddenly looked absurd. You lost friends during this time, not because you became judgmental or preachy, but because you couldn't participate in the collective delusion anymore. When everyone's pretending the emperor has clothes, the person who points out his nakedness gets exiled, gets labeled negative or difficult or overly sensitive. Jung called this seeing through the collective shadow, recognizing the unconscious agreements groups make to avoid painful truths. Every family, every organization, every culture has shadows. Things everyone knows, but nobody acknowledges. The alcoholic uncle nobody mentions. The office bully everyone enables. The systemic injustice everyone benefits from. And as long as everyone maintains the silence, as long as everyone agrees not to name what's happening, the system functions smoothly. But when you went through your transformation, when your soul dragged you into consciousness, you lost the ability to maintain that silence. You couldn't laugh at racist jokes anymore, couldn't pretend they were harmless. You couldn't ignore emotional abuse disguised as care, couldn't call manipulation love just because it came from family. You couldn't celebrate achievements built on exploitation, couldn't worship success that required destroying others. This made you uncomfortable to be around. Not because you were constantly confronting people or preaching at them, but because your presence itself was a mirror showing them what they were avoiding. Many people chose to distance themselves from you rather than look at that reflection, rather than question the lies they'd built their lives on. This hurt deeply because you didn't choose to see these things. You would have preferred to stay blind, to keep your comfortable illusions. But Jung knew this radical disillusionment was necessary, was part of the individuation process. You can't build a conscious life while participating in unconscious lies. You can't become yourself while pretending along with everyone else. The sixth sign is the tension of opposites. You learn to hold two conflicting truths at once without falling apart, without needing to resolve them into a simple answer. You could feel devastated and hopeful simultaneously, experiencing grief and gratitude in the same breath. You could be angry at someone you love without the anger destroying the love, recognizing that both feelings were real and valid. You could acknowledge your flaws while recognizing your value, seeing your shadow without losing sight of your light. Before this test, before the Nigredo burned away your false certainties, you lived in black and white thinking. Things were either good or bad. People were either right or wrong. You were either succeeding or failing. This binary thinking felt safe because it was simple, clear, decisive. It gave you rules to follow, categories to sort reality into, but it was also childish, a defense against the complexity and messiness of reality, against the truth that most of life exists in shades of grey. When you entered the Nigredo, when your soul dragged you into the fire, life forced you into the grey areas. You had to hold paradoxes that your mind wanted, desperately to resolve into simple categories. You loved your family and recognized their toxicity. You were grateful for your past and mourned what it cost you. You valued your sensitivity and hated how much it hurt. Jung called this the transcendent function, the psychological capacity to contain opposing forces without collapsing into one or the other, without choosing sides when both sides are true. This is what spiritual maturity actually means, what wisdom looks like in practice. Not having all the answers, but being able to sit with questions, not resolving all conflicts, but learning to be the container for them without being torn apart. You became strong enough to feel everything, without needing to immediately fix it, explain it, or make it go away. You learned that you can be broken and whole at the same time, that wholeness isn't the absence of brokenness, but the integration of it. You discovered that you can grieve what you lost while celebrating what you're becoming, holding both mourning and hope without betraying either. This capacity to hold tension is what Jung believed separated mature souls from those still trapped in unconscious simplicity. It's uncomfortable, it's painful, but it's also what makes you truly human, rather than a machine running on simple programs. The seventh and final sign is the return of the child. After all that darkness, after walking through fire and facing every demon in your psyche, something unexpected happened. A quiet joy returned, but it was different from anything you'd felt before. Not the loud happiness of achievement or validation, not the desperate excitement of distraction or pleasure, not the manic energy of accomplishment. This was softer, deeper, more authentic. A genuine curiosity about life started emerging from the ashes of who you used to be. You found yourself noticing small things again, the way light hits a wall at golden hour, the sound of rain on windows, the taste of food when you actually paid attention. You felt creative impulses that had nothing to do with productivity or success or proving yourself. You wanted to play, to explore, to create just for the sake of creating, without needing it to mean something or become something. Jung called this the divine child archetype, the part of you that existed before the world told you who to be, before conditioning buried your authentic nature. When you were actually a child, you had to suppress this authentic self to survive in a world that didn't always welcome it. You learned what was acceptable and what wasn't, what got you love and what got you punished or rejected. You adapted, you performed, you became who you needed to be to stay safe, to be loved, to belong. But that divine child never died, despite what the trauma tried to do. It went underground, into hiding, waiting patiently for the moment when you'd be strong enough to protect it, when you'd clear away enough false identity to make room for something real. The joy you feel now isn't naive, isn't the innocence of ignorance. It's earned through suffering and integration. It exists alongside your awareness of pain, loss, and darkness, rather than denying those realities. You're not returning to childhood innocence. You're discovering adult innocence, a much rarer and more valuable thing. The ability to be genuinely present, genuinely curious, genuinely yourself without needing the world's permission or approval. All 7 signs point to the same truth. The test wasn't random suffering, it was an initiation. Your soul put you through fire not to destroy you, but to burn away everything that wasn't authentically you. The career that gave you status, but killed your spirit. The relationships built on need, rather than genuine connection. The beliefs you inherited, but never chose. The identity you performed, but never inhabited. All of it had to go, not because it was bad, but because it wasn't yours. Jung spent his entire career studying this transformation because he lived it himself. His confrontation with the unconscious almost destroyed him. He documented in his Red Book the visions, the terrors, the complete dissolution of everything he thought he knew. He emerged from that darkness with a mission to help others understand that this journey, as painful as it is, leads somewhere extraordinary. You don't just survive this process, you evolve into what Jung called the individuated self. The person who knows who they are beneath all the masks, who can hold their darkness without being consumed by it, who can love without losing themselves. The pain you endured was the fire that burns away everything false. The isolation was the crucible where transformation happens. The shattering of your persona was the breaking that lets authentic light emerge. You are not damaged goods. You are refined gold. You passed the test that most people spend their entire lives avoiding, and you came out the other side fundamentally changed. The old you, the one who needed everyone's approval, who chased external validation, who built an identity on sand, that person died, and something real was born in their place. In The Alchemist's Path, perception training for empaths, you'll turn overwhelm into wisdom with practical drills, Jung-inspired boundaries, and step-by-step perception training. This guide includes 3 exclusive chapter videos to deepen each lesson. Written by Surreal Mind, 236 pages, beautifully designed 8.5 by 11 downloadable ebook, in stock now. Start your training today. Feel deeply while thinking clearly. Get The Alchemist's Path at thesurrealmind.com.